Welcome to the Court of History. I'm Sean Wilentz with my co-host, Sidney Blumenthal, and we're here for our Thanksgiving edition. We're going to be talking about a lot of things, but we're going to be talking about history. This is a time when people are thinking back on the Pilgrim Fathers, if you will, but they're thinking about American history generally. In fact, Sid, I don't know if you've been watching the Ken Burns production on the American Revolution, but it has certainly brought those events into the, leading up to the 250th. We're getting a preview of that with Ken Burns. Have you had a chance to see it?
I have. I've seen it. It is it's a grim struggle, and we're getting the thought of some of the founders in it, and we need to pull that out and really discuss it further to really understand where we are today as well.
Yes, I think that's right. It's there's a lot about the war, I gather, in the series, which is very, very important. But it's important to see what the ideas were, on what this country is based, possibly now more than ever. And we have exactly the right person with us today to talk about all of that, and that is Jeffrey Rosen. Jeff Rosen is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, an extraordinary institution that I encourage everyone to try and see. He's also a professor of law at George Washington University. He has had a long and storied career, beginning with his clerkship with the great Abner Mikva and the D.C. Court of Appeals way back when, after which, and maybe this is most important to the three of us, after which for a long time, from 1992 until 2014, he was the legal affairs editor or correspondent, I can't remember which, but something like that, at the Old New Republic, where Sidney was a senior editor and I was a contributing editor for many years. And that's where we first all got together. Along the way, with all of that, he has written some 10 books, believe it or not, including the one we're going to be talking about today. But that barely begins to describe Jeffrey Rosen, Renaissance man. He has a podcast, his own podcast, coming out of the National Constitution Center. He's also a composer. And I had the great privilege to be able to hear him sing and perform songs that he had written based on his book before this called The Pursuit of Virtue. And actually, you can see that now. It's been posted by WHYY from Philadelphia. Go online, hear this. I was in the audience. I was happy to be there, privileged to be there. So this really is an extraordinary person we have on store today. Welcome to the Court of History, Jeff Rosen.
Thank you so much, Sean. It is a joy to be here with you and Sid. Our time at the New Republic was so meaningful and illuminating, and I'm so grateful to you, Sean, for having read a draft of The Pursuit of Liberty and improved it beyond measure, saving me from errors of fact and judgment. And I can't wait for our discussion about the Court of History.
Great. And the book is entitled The Pursuit of Liberty, How Hamilton versus Jefferson ignited the lasting battle about power in America. That's the book. So it's Hamilton and Jefferson. You framed American politics, constitutional law, everything around that essential dispute. And this is not the first time this has happened, but you do it in an extremely imaginative and thorough way. For our viewers, though, Jeff, why don't you just set up what the battle between Hamilton versus, what was Hamilton versus Jefferson all about? What are the basic differences between the two? Why did it even happen?
The battle between Hamilton and Jefferson is about four major conflicts about the meaning of the American idea. And they all involve the balance between liberty and power. Broadly, Jefferson believes that all increases in government power threaten liberty, and Hamilton thinks that increases in government power can secure liberty. And that plays out in their debates over, first, national power versus states' rights. Second, rule by elites versus democracy. Third, executive power versus constraints on executive power, including by the judiciary. And fourth, liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution. And Hamilton and Jefferson are on opposite sides of all four of those questions, and they have defined all of American history.
Indeed. And, well, we'll get to the second part first, but let's just narrow down a little bit about what they were arguing about. In effect, it was an argument about a single word, which is the word necessary. If you look at it closely, they were arguing about whether the first bank in the United States, which is the central part of Hamilton's financial program, was constitutional or not. And the question was it a necessary, was it a necessary thing for the government to pursue, federal government to pursue? Jefferson said no. Hamilton said yes. There were implications about that, though, quite apart from the Constitution. I mean, it had to do with an entire vision, really, of what the United States was going to be now that the government had been launched, right? I mean, it goes beyond simply a question of niceties of wording in the Constitution.
Well, absolutely. But the question of how nicely words should be construed is the central interpretive debate on the Supreme Court for all of American history. So it turns out it's not the debate between originalism and non-originalism. It's between liberal and strict construction of the Constitution. And in fighting over the meaning of the word necessary, Jefferson says that it should be construed to mean absolutely or indispensably necessary to carry out an enumerated power. And Hamilton counters that it can be useful or conducive to carrying out an implied power. So it's really that difference between enumerated and implied powers and strict versus liberal construction that is at the center not only of the debate over the bank, as you say, but the debate over the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise and Congress's power to ban slavery in the territories, the debate over the constitutionality of the post-Reconstruction Civil Rights Acts, the debate over the constitutionality of the New Deal administrative state, and in our era, debates over the constitutionality both of Obamacare and of the Voting Rights Act and the tariffs and many of the questions that are at the center of the challenges to the Trump administration. So it really is the central interpretive debate in American history.
But in that, though, is also the question of democracy, which you mentioned very early on. That is one of the things that's different: elitism versus democracy. With Jefferson, I assume you're saying, I know you're saying because I read your book, that Jefferson is the Democrat and Hamilton is much more the elitist, and that's evident from the Constitutional Convention onwards. How does that play out in your book, in your understanding of this basic division between the two?
Well, this debate is pervasive in American history, and it has to do with their distrust or trust of the people. And Jefferson insists that the will of the majority should always prevail, and he wants ultimately some degree of accountability to the people, by which he means white men at the local level, by all the branches of government. And Hamilton favors rule by elites. He distrusts the mob. And this division plays out in their debates at the Constitutional Convention over how to structure the presidency and the other branches of government, with Hamilton proposing a life term for the president because he fears a future demagogue who will court the people and persuade them to surrender their liberties in exchange for cheap luxuries. And his solution is a life term for the president. And Jefferson, who fears a demagogue who will impose himself from above rather than below, no one less than Julius Caesar, proposes a 1-year term limit for the president. Just to make this more concrete, I start the book with a dinner party that defined America, and this is a year after the one where
we were not invited.
Yeah, we weren't there, but we were old enough to be there. We just weren't invited. That's the problem.
It's not one to miss because it kind of defined America's political parties for the next 200 years. And at some point in the evening, Washington is away. Hamilton says, "Who are those 3 guys on the wall?" And Jefferson says, "My 3 greatest men in history, John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton." And Hamilton, according to Jefferson, pauses and then blurts out, "The greatest man in history was Julius Caesar." And this leads Jefferson to conclude that Hamilton is not only for a monarchy, but a monarchy bottomed on corruption. And he goes on to found the Democratic Republican Party in opposition to the supposed Caesarism and monarchism of Hamilton and the Federalists. It's a striking story because Ron Chernow concludes that Hamilton may have been joking because he too feared a Caesar who would be a sort of demagogue who would subvert liberty from below. It's also possible Jefferson was exaggerating or misremembering years later. He's writing this in his annus, and he wasn't always reliable in his memories. But the point is that this disagreement over what is the greatest threat to democracy, is it the demagogue or the authoritarian, relates to their different views about democracy. And Hamilton, who mistrusts the people, fears the demagogue, and Jefferson, who trusts the people, fears the authoritarian. Significantly, both of them converge in their opposition to Aaron Burr, who they believe is the crypto Caesar. As Hamilton wonderfully says, if we have an embryo Caesar, 'tis Burr.
And indeed, Hamilton's faction of the Federalists actually makes Jefferson president in part because they want to prevent Aaron Burr from becoming president in 1801.
Yeah, but the Roman figure they identify with Burr is Catiline, who is the conspirator who is trying to overthrow the Roman Republic. And just a couple things I want to note and get your reaction to about Jefferson and Hamilton. Hamilton, of course, famously in the Federalist Papers, writes about energy in the executive, but he also warns against a kind of authoritarian Caesarism as well, and sees in Burr, who winds up killing him, a Catiline. Jefferson, meanwhile, who is warning against overreaching government and becomes a proponent in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of states' rights, interposing against federal authority. And that's in the great conflict with John Adams as president, with Hamilton attempting a kind of quasi-coup through the military. It's all very political and circumstantial. And Jefferson, in the end, as you note, winds up promulgating the greatest act of federal authority, probably in U.S. history, which is the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, you cite Henry Adams in his great book on the administrations of Jefferson and Madison. And of course, Henry Adams, the grandson of John Adams, of John Quincy Adams, and great-grandson of John Adams, picks up the Adams banner in order to point this out in those books. So we're dealing with a lot of complexities and shades of gray also in these ideas you're raising.
Very much so. And the remarkable thing about Hamilton and Jefferson is that they're both protean figures, to use the phrase of Merrill Peterson, Jefferson's biographer, who can be invoked by both sides on either sides of any constitutional question. It's why they're, by being ultimately malleable and allowing presidents and justices and citizens to pick and choose among the various components of their ideals throughout history, they've remained the essential framework for our debates, even as both sides have betrayed the principles in those debates repeatedly. I think that's why the image that came to my mind in describing their ideas was golden and silver threads woven throughout American history, sometimes crossing, sometimes pulling apart, sometimes almost snapping when the tension is too great. But it's the productive tension on both sides of the threads that has sustained the American idea.
I was just teaching, in fact, the Missouri Compromise, and there you see in the debates, the Republicans who want to restrict slavery, keep it out of Missouri, are invoking Jefferson. The pro-slavery people, sometimes they're a little bit weird about Jefferson, but nevertheless, they try to claim him. Jefferson himself, of course, has his own ideas, which is to end slavery by bringing it to Missouri. Don't ask me, don't even start. But throughout the 19th century, we see all of this. We can go back to that. But there was a point, we talked about the New Republic earlier. There was a point in 1909, I believe, when Herbert Crowley, who had a lot to do with the New Republic, tried to find a way to synthesize Jefferson and Hamilton. And you go into that as well in your book.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. It was Crowley's phrase in The Promise of the American Life, calling on Theodore Roosevelt to deploy Hamiltonian means to achieve Jeffersonian ends, that is, the Hamiltonian means of strong federal power to achieve the Jeffersonian ends of curbing the corporations and fulfilling the promise of democracy, that led me to write the book. Sean, I had always been struck by Crowley, but it was rereading the edition of Crowley that you co-edited with Frank Foer, where you, in your footnote, had traced that phrase to a later description of Crowley. Crowley didn't use it himself.
Right.
It just sparked my curiosity and made me wonder whether anyone had traced the competing threads of the Hamilton and Jefferson debate throughout American history. And to my great surprise, I found that although lots of folks have described the debate in its own time, and there were books tracing the separate influences of Jefferson and Hamilton over time, no single book had traced both of their influences over time all the way up. So that was what I decided to do. And it was all sparked by Crowley and the fact that Theodore Roosevelt embraced Crowley to the degree of quoting him and saying, I am a Hamiltonian with regard to federal power and a Jeffersonian on democracy. And that just opened up this wonder of learning and discovery about how specifically presidents throughout history had read histories of Hamilton and Jefferson and had embraced them and repurposed them to support their own visions.
You give us some examples besides TR of presidents who are influenced by these characters.
Well, let me just say, Jeff, let's talk about Abraham Lincoln for a moment and make sure you don't forget him in this, because
the Lincoln biographer speaks, but that's good.
Yes, all honor to Jefferson, he said, albeit a slave owner. He is the one who wrote the preface to the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Lincoln, of course, cited as a famous Hamiltonian and yet also a Jeffersonian in his advancement of democracy, the early fusion. And why don't you comment on that?
Absolutely. And Sid, in your wonderful, your path-breaking books about Lincoln, you show that evolution. And I asked you that question when I started writing this book. I said, why was it that Lincoln, who was so Hamiltonian in his views on federal power that he embraced Hamilton's American system through Henry Clay, nevertheless invoked Jefferson as his idol? And you gave an answer that I think is true, which is that he was a politician and he wanted to win. And by that point, Hamilton's name was toxic, and everyone was a Jeffersonian in the era of good feeling, as you note, with Henry Clay, the founder of the Whigs, who'd also studied with Jefferson's law tutor, George Wythe, embracing Jefferson as his model, even as he took a Hamiltonian view of federal power. And then Lincoln, in such a sophisticated way, talks about how the parties, like drunken men who, exchanging their coats, ended up changing their heroes, with Lincoln embracing the Jefferson of the Declaration rather than of secession to defend the end of slavery. So Lincoln was, with his deep reading of history and his primary source research in the Springfield Law Library, that convinced him that Roger Taney made a libel on the founders when he said the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, as Douglas did as well, embracing Jefferson for his own ends. And that was why, as you say, Sid, he said all honor to Jefferson and stood in front of Independence Hall in 1861 and said, I've never had a thought politically that didn't stem from the Declaration of Independence.
I just want to break in on one thing, though.
Yeah.
By the time Lincoln writes that letter in 1859, the secessionists, the people who supported him in the North, were actually in many cases denouncing the Declaration of Independence, denouncing the idea that all men are created equal. Rufus Choate, who was not a Southerner but nevertheless was kind of a doughface, said that the Declaration of Independence was just a series of glittering generalities. Which is what and Lincoln was infuriated Lincoln. And so to the extent that the proto-Confederates, soon to become secessionist Confederates, were repudiating Jefferson, it made Lincoln all the more a Jeffersonian in effect.
Yeah, let me just add one thing, Sean, here, and I want Jeff to jump in because it follows from your talk about the secessionists and the origins of that. And you mentioned Clay. Clay, of course, was very much a Jeffersonian in the start of his career, and they all sort of were, because the Federalists had been discredited after the War of 1812, in which Clay, of course, was instrumental as a war hawk, the first war hawk. And among them was John C. Calhoun. They were all together. And then they all split apart. And Calhoun himself was a great Hamiltonian, the great nationalist. And then he reversed himself. And it wasn't simply that he became a Jeffersonian. He became an anti-Jeffersonian in his opposition to democracy itself. And that's where they wind up denouncing the Declaration that becomes a justification for secession.
That perfectly puts the evolution, Sid. And Calhoun, as you say, is the central figure in his complete flip-flopper evolution, or let's just put it more specifically, his hypocrisy on the question of federal power, because he is a Hamiltonian nationalist until it clashes with the interests of the slaveocracy, in which case he then embraces the secessionist vision that he previously repudiated. And the fact that both sides are also tying themselves in knot to evoke different visions of Jefferson on federal power, remembering that Jefferson himself in 1784 in the so-called Jefferson Proviso of the Northwest Ordinance had supported Congress's power to ban slavery in the territories, and then switches when it comes to the Louisiana Purchase, and then switches again when it comes to the Missouri Compromise, allows Calhoun to pick and choose among his Jeffersons until finally the soaring promise of the Declaration that all men are created equal becomes impossible to argue away from, at which point he repudiates the ideals of the Declaration itself.
Yes. Meanwhile, the Free Soil Party makes Jefferson their hero because of the original land ordinance in 1784, and then the Northwest Ordinance. He is a free soiler, they say, and that's why they embrace him. So it's a complicated story. But look, we're kind of running down for our first half of our Thanksgiving presentation with Jeff Rosen. We're going to conclude right now, but please come back. We'll be back with you very, very shortly, and for part 2 of our Thanksgiving edition about Hamilton, Jefferson, and the great Jeff Rosen.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.